very briefly, I'm very delighted and honored to have Seth here. He's visiting on his way back from some conferences in Hamburg and London dealing with the internet and privacy issues, which I'm sure he'll touch upon. And then from here, he's going to the MIT Mystery Hunt, which is a major event he's been going to for about 8 years, I think. Mm-hmm. It's quite wonderful, and you can look it up online. So he's in transition on his way back to San Francisco, where he works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's been the staff technologist there for, I think, about 13 years, sorry. He's been there a long time. And he'll tell you about EFF and what they do and their mission in terms of protecting the internet and freedom of speech and information. He's a local kid. He grew up in basically Northampton. He went to JFK, and he has also lived in East Hampton and South Deerfield. And he had the great, I should say, privilege of going to Northfield Mount Hermon, which I think really molded him. It had a tremendous impact. And we're very honored that tonight we have two teachers. It's wonderful, Pack and Dick Peller, who've come to hear Seth talk. So it's kind of, what a nice reversal in a way for, you know, one of their students to now come and be able to talk about what he's doing.
I remember meeting Seth when he was in 8th grade and coming for a visit.
Really?
To Northfield Mount Hermon.
You were talking about limits.
You say so.
So he's going to talk tonight about issues of internet privacy and security. He's going to make a formal presentation, which may go on for a bit. It's quite intense, and it's a challenge, you know, to talk for people who are quite learned in the subject and those who are new to it. But he'll be making his presentation, which will be followed by questions and answers, and then further discussion after that. Okay? Seth Schoen.
Thanks. It's really nice to be here, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming out. I was just saying that I just gave a presentation to about 800 people in Hamburg about a computer security project that we're working on, and I find this presentation much more intimidating. Apart from the family and hometown aspect, the presentation in Hamburg was very specific about a very specific technical subject, and the people who came were all technical experts who were eager to hear about that subject, and they knew what they were in for. And I think trying to present some of the landscape of what we deal with and what we think about and what we work on every day is rather challenging, because it's such a wide topic, a broad topic, with so much detail in so many different directions. Does anyone recognize this location? It looks actually like a lot of other locations. These objects are called radomes. They're used to protect radio antennas. They protect the radio antennas both against the weather conditions and against people seeing them and knowing what sort of radio antenna is inside. So there are two senses of protecting the radio antenna. This is a location that I've actually been to a few years ago. It's a place called Teufelsberg in the former West Berlin. It's a big hill outside of town. And the US National Security Agency during the Cold War set up a spying post on top of this hill with a whole bunch of antennas that were concealed inside these radomes. And they were spying on the East Berliners' radio signals with them for decades. Around the end of the Cold War, the base was abandoned, and it's now a modern ruin, a modern surveillance ruin, and people just sort of hike up to the top and walk into these buildings and walk around and say, here's where they spied on people. So it's an interesting site to visit, and a lot of the computer enthusiasts and privacy folks in Berlin like to make pilgrimages up there to have a peek at it. So one question I wanted to pose to all of you is, suppose that you didn't actually tell anybody that you were coming here tonight, but somebody wanted to know, well, who is it who decided to come out to the Arts Bank and hear this presentation? How might they be able to figure out who is here? Sounds like there's someone else here. So how might the whoever it is who's interested in knowing who would want to come hear a talk like this be able to figure out who is here?
I emailed him.
Okay, so maybe they've read your email about it.
You emailed me.
You put it on Facebook saying you were coming?
Yeah, so people might talk publicly about where they were. Someone might have software to analyze that and be able to quickly search through and say who attended what.
Cell phone signals?
Cell phone signals are definitely what I'm most thinking of, what first comes to mind for me. When we're thinking about the question of how cheap and easy it could be to try to make a list of who was here, and how automatic it could be. If you wanted to say, I want to do this on a large scale over and over again, and have the capability to make lists of who goes to which meetings, who goes to which lectures, who goes to which places at the same time. I think cell phone signals are a very powerful way of doing that. And it's also something that can be done potentially afterwards. If you observe the cell phone signals, or if you have a source of historical data about the cell phone signals, you could actually go back in time and say who was there last week, who was there a month ago. And this may sound kind of futuristic or hypothetical to some people who don't follow this area, but it's actually quite a practical technique. So it has to do with the way that the mobile phone networks are constructed. It has to do with the fact that your mobile phone can move from one cell to another. That's what makes the cellular network cellular. That's why it's called that. There are different towers at different locations, and they overlap each other. And you can see sometimes these maps of where all the cell towers are. Sometimes for marketing purposes from companies saying we have great coverage. Sometimes like the Federal Communications Commission will have maps. They'll have information about where are the towers. Well, the idea of the mobile network is that you want to be able to have a call even when you're moving from one place to another, even when you're in motion. So therefore, the towers are able to do what they call a handoff. So you're talking on your phone, you're talking to a particular tower while you travel, say, by car to Greenfield, and there's maybe another tower there. As you approach Greenfield, the cellular network figures out that it would now be better to switch you over to the cell tower in Greenfield. So the network invisibly behind the scenes does this handoff, and now you're talking to Greenfield instead of Deerfield, let's say. The trouble, of course, is that in order to make this work well, all of these cell towers have to make observations to figure out what is the best cell tower to handle this communication right now. In other words, they've all got to measure the strength of the radio signal that's coming from your phone so that they can say, well, earlier Deerfield was the best place to handle this, but as this person is traveling, now the signal is stronger in Greenfield and weaker in Deerfield. And as a result of that, all of the cell towers have the ability built in as a sort of technical necessity to make these signal strength measurements of all of the mobile devices that are connecting to them. And again, they need that in order to figure out which tower should handle your call. The problem from the privacy view that we get from this is that if you have 3 towers, and here's a geometry problem for you, it's sort of a classical geometry construction problem, like the straight edge and compass things. The signal strength is closely related to how far you are from the tower. As you're close to it, your signal is stronger. As you're far from it, your signal is weaker. And I forgot to paste a diagram in here, but you imagine your 3 different towers in 3 different cities, 3 different neighborhoods. Each of them has an estimate of how strong or how weak your radio signal is, which means each of them has an estimate of how far you are from that tower. Well, you can draw a circle. You say, this tower thinks I'm 2 miles away. This tower over here thinks I'm 3 miles away. This tower over here thinks I'm 1.5 miles away. Each of those forms a circle, and those circles approximately should intersect in a point. And that is the mobile phone network's estimate of your location. Now, the ability to do this originally was sort of a historical accident. It turned out to be something that the companies were interested in, that first responders for emergency situations, for example, were interested in. If you call 911, they wanted to be able to find out where you are so they can come rescue you even if you don't know where you are, or even if you can't explain it to them. So there was actually a governmental initiative to say carriers ought to develop the ability to take advantage of this to figure out where you are. So if you're in a car accident and you call up, they say, well, it's about this far from this tower, about that far from that tower, about that far from that tower, it's probably in this region right here. Of course, you don't always want to be located in this way. And it turns out, even when you're not making a call, in order for other people to be able to call you, the network wants to find where you are, so that if someone should call you, they know which tower to use to contact your phone to make it ring. So that means even when you're not on the phone, your phone is actually sending out these radio signals. We sometimes call them pings. And it's saying, hi there, I'm such and such a phone. Just letting you know I'm here. And it does this over and over and over again. And that means you have records. I actually forgot to check about the network here. I was going to show a little animation. Maybe at the end, I'll just see if I can get online and show this animation. A German politician who was quite concerned about the privacy implications of this decided to ask his phone company, do you have historical records of my physical location? Now at that time, Germany, like a number of other European jurisdictions, had adopted a law that said that communications companies had to keep track of the data that they incidentally acquired about their customers. And so it turned out that the phone companies were keeping all of these records for 6 months because they thought that was their legal obligation. Differently from the US, companies are obliged to turn over records about you to you on request. The US has no such obligation. We have this in very special cases like credit reporting. You can get your credit report because there's a special law that says that the financial institutions have to turn over the information about you that they've collected. In most European countries, this is a general obligation of anyone who collects personal data of any sort. That if you write to them and say, what do you know about me? They've got to respond and turn over what they know about you. So this politician a few years ago, and I will try to show the video at the end, wrote to his phone company and said, do you know where I've been for the last 6 months? And of course their first response was, well, we do, but we don't really want to give you that data. So he had a lawyer get in touch with them and say, you know, I'm sure you're aware that your obligation under German data protection law is to give people access to the information about themselves. And they were ultimately persuaded to. And he decided to publish it so that people would get a sense of what it is that the phone companies know about people. And they actually produced this animation, and you can watch it speeded up by a factor of about 100. And you see him traveling around Germany for 6 months because that's what the phone company was able to give him. And it's quite remarkable, and of course this is information that the phone companies are in a position to determine to obtain about each and every one of us. So I think this is really an emblematic example of the kind of situation we find ourselves in, where there's a technical system that people have adopted for some reason, for practical convenience, for practical necessity. And it turns out that it's generating data, and it turns out that it's generating a lot of data. And it turns out that it's producing a really major qualitative change in the kind of surveillance and the kind of tracking that can be done. So that there just is a place where you could go and look and you can learn all these facts about people that were simply not available anywhere in the past.
And are there no problems anymore about the data storage space?
Yeah, so that's been an interesting thing. There have been reasons in the past why companies didn't necessarily want to retain everything, because hard drives were expensive. And the companies would say, well, we don't know when we're going to need this record. We're going to run out of hard drive space. Like a lot of other areas of technology, hard drives have been on a sort of exponential curve where the amount of storage that you can get per dollar has been falling exponentially for years. I remember around the time that I started high school, I bought about a 500 megabyte, it was either a 500 megabyte hard drive for $300 or a 300 megabyte hard drive for $500. In any case, if any of you have bought any kind of storage device recently, you can imagine it's drastically cheaper than that now. The hard drives that are on sale today are reaching the 8 terabyte range, which is, a terabyte is about 1 million times larger than a megabyte. So I had, the current hard drives are probably about 2,000 to 10,000 times larger than the hard drives that I was buying in high school. So essentially the economic constraints on retaining data, on storing data on a massive scale have been sort of going out the window. And in the past, in fact, when some governments proposed laws saying that, for example, internet service providers ought to retain records about where are people going online, what are they doing online. In the 1990s, the internet service providers were able to make a very credible case that that would be very, very expensive for them. Because people do so much online, it would require buying an enormous amount of storage capacity in order to keep track of that. And the strength of that argument has been in drastic decline. And I've done some of these calculations. Trying to argue against legislative proposals like this today on cost grounds, it's very, very difficult because the costs are actually minuscule. So, as I said at the outset, I think this is kind of a large topic, and I'm not sure exactly which facets people most want to hear about and which facets I'll be able to cover. Of course, I work on surveillance issues in some sense almost every day. Many of my colleagues do as well. My organization is called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're based in San Francisco. Our organization has existed for 24 years, and I've worked there for 13 of those years. It's the largest organization in the world that's devoted entirely to civil liberties in the context of technology. Of course, there are other organizations like ACLU that also work in this field. We're the largest organization that focuses entirely on technological aspects of civil rights and civil liberties. And we work on many fronts. So we have lawyers who go to court, who sue the government, who sue companies, who bring test cases about important legal issues. We have activists who campaign in Congress, who pressure companies about their decisions that impact technology users' rights. We have technologists like myself who are involved in research and development, in public education, in developing privacy software tools, other things of this sort. So we have a very sort of multifaceted collaboration where one day someone will say, why don't we sue the government? And one day someone will say, why don't we write some privacy software? And one day someone will say, why don't we run a media campaign? It's sort of all over the place. But surveillance has been a very major theme for us, electronic surveillance. Monitoring people, monitoring people's whereabouts, monitoring people's relationships, monitoring people's interactions. And for any of these aspects, I feel like I could talk for quite a long time about any facet of this. So something that is fun but terrifying, if you're a technology geek, is to think about particular surveillance techniques. Think about if you wanted to spy on someone, how could you do it? If you were a spy agency and you were trying to set up capabilities to monitor people, to break into people's stuff, to know what people are doing, to know where people are, to know who people are, what are the technical means that you could use? If someone wanted to overhear your private conversations, how would they do it? If someone wanted to know what you were doing on your computer, but not looking directly at your screen, how would they do it? We can talk about some of those at some lengths and the sort of really alarming extent to which they have been developed and are being developed and seem likely to continue to be developed. There's also the question of what do we do technologically in response? Are there technological things we can do to protect our privacy, to make surveillance harder, to make it harder for people to, for example, intercept our communications? And then what do those techniques actually accomplish and what do they not accomplish? Which can be a very subtle point. Because a lot of people hearing about some of the scary stuff that's out there say, okay, I want an app for my phone, or I want an app for my computer that's going to protect me, right? And in fact, with the information that we've gotten from Edward Snowden, whom I'll talk a lot about in a few minutes, there's been a real resurgence in popular attention to privacy issues and electronic surveillance issues. And a lot of companies have popped up and said, we're going to save you with our tech product. You just need to install our app and then you're going to be safe. And unfortunately, a massive portion of that is snake oil, or is oversold in the sense that the product accomplishes a very narrow thing, which is not necessarily what you might think of as safeguarding your privacy in the broadest sense. So there's a question about what can we do in response and what does it get us. There's also, of course, the history and culture of surveillance. There's people trace surveillance back to the Middle Ages and monarchs setting up intelligence services and trying to spy on people. The history of surveillance in wartime, the history of the politics around surveillance, the history of laws that purport to regulate government surveillance activities or private sector collection of personal information. And then, of course, there's who's doing what. So the National Security Agency, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency of the US government, has gotten probably the most attention of any entity in the world that practices surveillance because of a lot of very sensational revelations that came out about their activities in the past year. But of course, they're far from the only ones who are engaged in mass surveillance or who are engaged in developing surveillance capabilities. You've got law enforcement at all levels of government, in every government, that are very interested in electronic surveillance means and methods and what can they get and what can they do. You've got foreign organizations, you've got other intelligence agencies within the US intelligence community. So it's very easy to have this focus and say, oh, NSA, they're the scary one, they're spying on everyone. And meanwhile, you've got intelligence agencies from the United Kingdom, from China, from Russia, from Australia, that are all in many ways trying to perform the same kinds of surveillance and sometimes against the same targets. And then you've got the more run-of-the-mill entities like the FBI that also are very, very interested in these questions, in how they can do wiretaps, in how they can get your location, in whether they can get your phone company to turn over data. So we can talk quite a bit about who's doing what, about some of the particular programs and methods that have been revealed by Edward Snowden or unearthed by journalists, about specific controversies, like the time I remember quite nostalgically from the 1990s, where we had a major political fight with the government over people's right to use encryption tools. Something that we thought we had won, and that's a controversy that's coming back repeatedly over the last couple of years, where governments are again questioning the public's right to use these encryption tools. Also controversies about things like government's use of hacking as a surveillance or investigative technique. Something that a lot of governments wanted to cover up, not talk about, and that recently we've learned all of a sudden has become normalized, and a lot of governments say, oh, of course we need to be able to hack people. Oh, of course that's a legitimate investigative technique. Something that for years was completely secret, and they spoke about it in very negative terms. And of course the substance of the Snowden leaks, which has attracted so much attention in the last year. So a very famous dystopian view, and I wrote 1948 deliberately because that was the year that he wrote it, so it's not a typo for 1984. So Orwell is perhaps the name that's most associated with this totalitarian vision of surveillance where everything can be surveilled at any moment. And so this is one of the most famous statements in Orwell's 1984 of the concept of total surveillance. So he refers to a telescreen, which could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. You had to live, I think this is a typo, I think it should be had to live, did live, from habit that became instinct in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. So this is a paragraph that has terrified many generations with this sort of dystopian vision of you have no private space. There's an entity that can know everything about you, that can know everything that you say, that can monitor you at any moment. And then you say, well, I want to have some privacy. Well, maybe in the darkness, the telescreen can't see you. Well, that's not actually true today. You can be seen in darkness perfectly well with an infrared camera. So the except in darkness part is kind of out. You can actually buy this camera for probably $100 or $200, and you can just watch people in total darkness. Because, of course, all objects emit infrared radiation. I'm sure you're quite familiar with the relationship between their temperature and the spectra of radiation that they emit, but even in darkness, it turns out that everything is glowing just in colors of light that our eyes can't see, but machines can see them. So with modern technology, it's already worse in this respect than what Orwell imagined, because we don't even have that sliver of privacy in the dark. All right. I thought of a few candidates for things that are sort of like the telescreen that Orwell describes that exists today. Some of you might have noticed that I have a Band-Aid covering my webcam here. I put the Band-Aid on my webcam when I read this article back in 2013. I had already heard rumors of this, but this was sort of the tipping point. This is an article, Meet the Men Who Spy on Women Through Their Webcams, and it talks about an internet subculture of men who mostly for voyeuristic purposes like to hack women's computers and monitor them surreptitiously through their webcams. And these men will gather on internet forums and trade these credentials and trade their access to control people's computers and to spy on people remotely through their computers. And this reporter decided to venture into this subculture a bit and interview some people and see what they were up to. And this is one of a number of rather horrifying articles that Nate Anderson from Ars Technica has written about different disturbing internet criminal subcultures. But this is a particular one that has a very strong nexus to the idea of secretly monitoring people, secretly observing people by video. And of course, most computers now come with a webcam. And we're reaching a moment where there are, in some sense, cameras everywhere all the time, where people are using these mobile phones that may have not just one camera, but two. They may have a front-looking camera and a back-looking camera. They're looking in both directions. So the trouble is that you want the camera to be under your control, but if someone is able to hack your device and bypass the normal software that would activate or deactivate the camera, they may be able to switch it on without your knowledge so that you don't have the ability to switch it off. And you resort to very low-tech things if you're aware of the risk, like covering it with a Band-Aid when you're not using it.
I have mine covered too.
I think it's really unfortunate that the manufacturers don't make shutters that you can just close when you're not intending to use the webcam. I think that would be very desirable. We've basically heard people say, well, it would cost $1 extra, and most people don't say they want it, so that's why it doesn't happen. Right. So here's one sort of telescreen-esque thing in terms of the inability to shut something off and the inability to know who is watching you when. Then there's the microphone in your cell phone. This is an earlier article by Declan McCullough and Anne Broach from 2006, reporting on the trend, which has really grown in significance since then, of the FBI attempting to use individual people's cell phones as bugs. Again, basically by hacking into the software on the cell phone and programming the cell phone to invisibly receive a phone call without displaying on the screen the fact that a phone call is in progress. So then the FBI calls you, and the FBI spyware on your phone picks up the line without displaying the fact that you're in a call. And then, of course, they're able to listen to what's going on in the environment around you. And this is a motivation for a number of more paranoid people to worry about whether there are cell phones in the room when they're having a sensitive conversation. And some people will even take the batteries out of their phones. There's a whole discussion about why do people do that instead of just turning them off, and we can get into that too. But this is a very real thing. Here the controversy has to do with whether the FBI has proper legal authority to do this to your phone, but not about the question about whether it's happening, because it is happening, and it's been happening.
Can we wrap our phones in aluminum foil?
Yeah, so if you can manage to block the radio signals, then they wouldn't be able to have the call. Of course, in principle, the phone has a lot of storage inside. So if they were clever with the spyware, it could record the audio and then upload it later. That's not what they were doing in this particular case that was reported in 2006.
And this is true of all cell phones, not just smartphones. This is even flip phones.
Yeah, it's often easier to hack smartphones in some ways. It's kind of complicated what the risks are to different devices. The smartphones in some cases have more vectors of attack to get in. But certainly there are documented cases of hacking feature phones, which are the phones prior to the smartphones. Here's another little telescreen sort of candidate. In some newer smartphones, not only can they detect when you're holding them up to your face, which is a feature that a number of smartphones have, this phone can detect when you're looking at it, and it detects when you look away. And the feature is that if you're watching a video on the phone, and you look to the side, the phone notices that you're not looking at it and it pauses the video. So the phone is actually aware of when is the human being looking at the phone and when is the human being looking elsewhere.
Could the same be said for art devices like yes.
Sure, a lot of those are not as useful for spying on people.
You think they've done it?
So there is a whole field of research about the security of medical devices. In fact, there's a lab at UMass Amherst that does a lot of research in that area. I think in collaboration with the University of Washington, if I remember correctly. And they're interested in the question of whether someone can hack a pacemaker, an implantable cardiac defibrillator, things like that. Unfortunately, the threat scenario for that tends to be more the fear of someone trying to hack it in order to assassinate someone, as opposed to hack it in order to monitor someone. But in general, medical devices have a lot of sensitivity, not only in terms of safety, but in terms of privacy. So a lot of people are wearing a device called a Fitbit. And the Fitbit is basically a bracelet that you wear in order to keep track of how much exercise you're getting. And it can sort of turn getting exercise into a game, because it can motivate you to get more exercise every day because it knows exactly what you did, and you challenge yourself to get more. The Fitbit contains a device called an accelerometer, which is able to analyze the nature of your motions while you're wearing it. That's turned out to be fairly sensitive because people have written a lot of software to classify, what is this kind of motion, what is that kind of motion, what is that kind of motion. And they've absolutely gotten the patterns down for things like walking, running, cycling, eating, sleeping, having sex. They've got patterns for all of these things, and they can classify your windows of activity. And of course, the default behavior is to upload logs of all of this to their servers. So in some cases, combined with your GPS location. So you're telling them, I was over here and I was doing this. And then they analyze it for you and give you a report. So it's possible that something might go wrong with that. So there is this sort of field of medical device security. There is also interest in the question of hacking hearing aids. Although there, people are talking about things like, could you cause people to hear things that weren't there?
Oh, voices, that's what they are.
Yeah.
They are literally in my ear.
It happens all the time.
Oh my.
Yeah, so there is a field of the medical device security, and it's interesting. It's not always totally tied to the surveillance issue, but it's a problem. I have a colleague, Cory Doctorow, who this week, he's a science fiction writer, now in the UK, and he just came back to EFF this week. He was a former colleague at EFF and left for a while and is now back. And he gives these speeches about the importance of the human user's control over the technology and not being controlled by someone else, whether it's a hacker or the manufacturer of the device. And he says in the modern era, we are constantly putting our bodies into computers and putting computers into our bodies. And he's referring to cars, which increasingly, in a sense, are computers and are completely computer controlled, and devices like pacemakers and hearing aids and any number of other devices. And he's saying there's a real practical autonomy concern. If you've got this device that you're putting your body into or putting into your body, and it's doing something very fundamental to your safety or your experience of day-to-day life, and someone else is in control of it, it's a really massive risk and loss of autonomy. So that was my last telescreen candidate for the moment. But I think a sad thought is that if you look at some of the concrete surveillance mechanisms that Orwell proposed, a lot of surveillance technologies that we have now that are in real use today are more intrusive and more pervasive than the ones that Orwell envisioned. Now you can still draw a distinction and say there's no single totalitarian regime operating the thought police and listening to all of these things. But on the technical level, in terms of the surveillance capabilities at a technical level, a lot of things we have now are more intrusive than what Orwell envisioned, literally so. So David Brin is another science fiction writer who likes to think about the future and wrote this book which is very critical of privacy advocates like myself. And a focus of this book, The Transparent Society, Brin says, sensors, not the people who prevent you from saying things, but the devices that detect things, the devices that sense the world around them, are constantly getting cheaper. They're constantly getting smaller, they're constantly getting less expensive. If you talk about a camera, if you talk about a microphone, if you talk about an accelerometer, which is again the thing in your Fitbit that can analyze your motion, if you talk about radio sensors, if you talk about temperature sensors, all of these things have been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and therefore have been getting incorporated in more and more devices, installed in more and more things and more places. So just the capacity of technology to detect the world around it has been growing and getting cheaper. And Brin forecasts that this is going to continue and says, look, you're going to, he forecasts for example, surveillance drones. This book is from 1998, and he says, well, in a few years, we're going to have these flying autonomous robots that can fly around and film you with a camera, and he's right. At that time, that was a real novelty or a real futuristic prediction. But he was absolutely right, that we have these autonomous drones that can fly around and film you from the air. And he gives a number of other examples and says, well, you know, at this rate, everyone will be carrying around cameras and microphones in their pockets. And now, of course, with mobile phones, they do. And so Britton's view is that there's essentially no way, as a pure matter of economics, to arrest the pressures and potentials for surveillance capabilities. And so Britton's prescription as a response to this is one that's quite distasteful to privacy advocates. And he says we need to give up, and we need to just say it's going to be possible to observe everything about everyone, and we need to make sure that that power is evenly distributed throughout society and not monopolized by an elite. And the privacy advocacy community regards that prescription as very difficult to follow in practice, feeling that an elite is very likely to be able to monopolize things in practice, and that you're not really going to be able to hold powerful people to account just because there's pervasive surveillance, which is Brin's optimistic notion.
Isn't that sort of like the mutual annihilation thing we had with Russia?
Yeah, so Brin's view is that it's not that bad that someone will be able to pervasively spy on you, because to some extent you'll be able to spy on them, and then you'll have a notion of why are they spying on you and what are they doing with the information. So you'll have some accountability. And this is his response to the idea that just economically and technologically, the surveillance situation is going to get more pervasive and more intense. So privacy advocates do dissent from this, but I'm going to return to this point that Brin's technological forecasting has been incredibly accurate. There's essentially nothing that he said about the trajectory of technology that's been proven wrong. So, a particularly depressing thought for me in this respect is to think about what do governments do when the governments want to have a secret conversation, a private conversation. Because you might think, yeah, it has to be a little more intense than that, but it's akin to that. Right, so you might think, well, the governments know a lot about this. They have spy agencies and spies, and they have people who are working for them, who are tech experts, who are studying the surveillance methods. So they know about it. So obviously, if it's possible to protect yourself somehow against all of this surveillance, the governments would know how. Well, this is their solution. It's called a SCIF, which is an acronym for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. There are a lot of these. Working in this field, I have never been privileged to go inside of one, but I know where some of them are, and I know that people go inside of them for various purposes. Sometimes lawyers who are working on national security cases actually do their work inside of one of these. The SCIF, there are many of them, right? So, I mean, if you go to any major city where there are federal government employees who are working with highly classified information, they have one of these. This is a vault, right? It's a vault with a strong lock, with a strong alarm, perhaps like that bank vault. But in addition, it has layers of acoustic isolation. So they've got acoustic isolation so that no sound can get in or out. They've got very intense electromagnetic shielding so that no radio waves can get in or out. And they've got other kinds of isolation and shielding, and of course the SCIF costs millions of dollars. It's very unpleasant to work inside of one. I spoke to someone who had worked inside of one quite a bit, and you're not permitted to bring a cell phone inside. And if you did, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't have any reception because this thing is blocking all of the cell phone signals. So just reflecting on this for a moment, this is the best solution that the experts in the governments can offer if you want to have a private conversation. You've got to go inside this locked, isolated vault and lock the door behind you and have it be soundproof and electromagnetically isolated, and don't bring your cell phone in, and don't bring any cameras in, and go inside there and do your private work, and then you can come out later when you're done. And that's the solution.
What assurance do you have that it's actually secure?
Yeah, so there's a whole industry of building these for the government, and they have mostly classified descriptions of how do you test whether it's good enough. And so since those are classified, I don't really know exactly how they test them, but they have a whole sort of test suite So I imagine that they go inside and have someone play a test sound, and they probably have someone outside with an audio meter, and they probably go inside and have someone bring a radio transmitter and have someone
If I
outside
was
with
a
a receiver.
competing agency, that would be my first target.
Sure, so a lot of people might be interested in whether they can sabotage a skiff. They also have like a bug sweeping staff that will go inspect the skiff for bugs, things like that. They try to make the inside not have a place where you could conceal a bug. There are a lot of precautions about this. It's very expensive and very inconvenient. So you might ask, why do they take all these precautions? Obviously, I've been giving some suggestions about reasons. A few of the reasons that I know of why they take these precautions include laser microphones. The laser microphone is a technology that's actually existed for some decades, but it's become a lot cheaper, where if someone were outside right now and wanted to listen to my voice, if they had a laser and a laser diode, they could bounce the laser off the window pane. When the laser bounces off the window pane and goes back to the receiver, it wiggles a little bit. And the reason that it wiggles a little bit is that the window pane is wiggling a little bit because of the pressure of my voice. And you can measure those wiggles, and then you amplify them, and they turn back into the sound signal of the ambient sound inside the room, and that's a laser microphone. And it works from a very long distance away if you have a line of sight to a glass window pane, a single pane window, connecting to the space where you want to listen in. There's also something that actually Leon Theremin invented. He was an electronic music expert and a spy from the former Soviet Union who invented that weird musical instrument that you play with your hands without touching it that makes the...
I could see you playing a theremin.
I've tried it, I wasn't very good at it. It's a cool instrument. So in addition to inventing the theremin, he also invented a bug that was called the Thing. And this is a radar-activated bug that has no power supply of its own and no transmitting capability of its own. But you can conceal it inside an object, and if you then go outside and illuminate it with radar and get the radar reflection will have a little wiggle in the signal that's also correlated with the audio in the room. Leon Theremin invented that, I think, in 1948, and it turns out the technology still works very well. We learned from some of the NSA leaks last year that NSA is actually building a number of devices that use that principle, where they have some kind of data that they can observe that's physically observable, and then they can go outside on the street and use radar to get a reflection with the data. So that's another reason, again, for the skiff, for using a safe like this, to prevent someone from putting a bug in that would be activated by radar. There are also a number of issues about if you can see something. There was just a paper a couple months ago where someone videotaped a potato chip bag through a window. Some of you may have come across this paper. So you might ask, what good is it to videotape a potato chip bag through the window?
There's actually a TED Talk.
Oh, great. I haven't seen the TED Talk, but I just saw the paper. Yeah, it's amazing research. Yeah, so some of you are clearly aware. This is another one of these audio makes things wiggle situations. A human being almost never can see the vibrations that are caused by a person's voice. If you're looking at a stringed instrument or something, you might be able to see the string vibrating. The potato chip bag also vibrates as a person speaks. Turns out if you have a good enough video camera, you can actually record the motion of the potato chip bag in such a way that you can analyze the slight changes in the image of the potato chip bag and reconstruct the audio in the room. There is another similarly remarkable thing. The old style computer displays are called cathode ray tubes, or CRTs. This is a newer technology. With the older technology, it turns out that there's this beam that's turning on the pixels one at a time. Boop, boop, boop. Now, to a human being, they all blend together, and you see them all as on wherever they're on and off wherever they're off. But it turns out there's a particular timing at the sub-millisecond level where each one was turned on. Someone discovered that if you can videotape how bright the wall is, it doesn't have to be in focus or anything, But whenever the monitor turns on a dot on the screen, the room gets a little brighter for a tiny fraction of a second because the monitor just turned on a dot. And of course, when it doesn't turn on the dot, the room doesn't get brighter. So the amount that the room gets brighter is almost negligible, and it's for a tiny fraction of a second. But if you can look at these patterns of when did the room get brighter and when did it not get brighter, and then run it through the appropriate mathematics, you say, oh, these are the dots that are turned on the screen. Because at this time offset, it got brighter in the room, and at this time offset, it didn't. And there's a whole field. And this stuff is fascinating and horrifying to read. A lot of this stuff is currently coming out of grad students in US universities, in other universities. I feel like graduate students right now are having a fun time sort of recreating the history of espionage probably from the 1970s and 1980s and getting PhDs for doing it. So the grad students sort of have these challenges where they say, what's the scariest thing you can do by analyzing a signal in a totally unexpected way and figuring out something that people would not think you could figure out. And I've seen more than a dozen of these things, and I bet that spy agencies knew about them or worried about them, at least by the 80s, but now graduate students are publishing them in open literature, figuring out how they work, how they can be made to work. So you've got things like, if you can listen to the ambient audio, if someone is typing on a keyboard, to a human being, all of the keys sound alike. To a computer, each key has its own sound that's different from the sound of every other key. So you have an audio recording of someone typing on the keyboard. Well, then it's like a cryptogram. You don't know which sound is which letter. But of course, some of you may see cryptograms in the newspaper. You've got each letter has been replaced with another letter, and you've got to figure out which is which. Well, it's the same problem with these sounds. You say, all right, here's something that this person typed. I have no idea which sound is which. But we've got to find some set of mappings back, and then we know which is which, and then we know what the person typed, just from the sound of it. It actually gets worse than that, but I won't prolong this point unless people are curious later on. But it turns out listening to the high-pitched whine of the computer, you can actually sometimes figure out some of the data that it's processing from the sound that the computer makes while processing the data. And then, of course, a bunch of issues about computers emit radio frequency signals, can be intercepted with an antenna to reconstruct data that the computer is processing. An amazing thing that Paul Kocher figured out, among other amazing things that he figured out in the 90s, is that if you measure how much power a computer is drawing and look at it with an oscilloscope, you actually see spikes and dips in how much power the computer is using. And for some kinds of operations, those spikes and dips correspond to the data that the computer is processing. So if you're out there looking at how much power my computer is using, and I'm doing something sensitive on here, you may actually be able to look at, from moment to moment to moment, exactly how much power did my computer draw, what was it doing? So all of these things are quite serious, and again are probably motivations for why people say we're better off in the safe, locked away, electromagnetically isolated, acoustically isolated. And I find that depressing because the public, of course, wants to have some kind of privacy. And the public doesn't necessarily want to spend all day in a safe. We want to be in an ordinary house or an ordinary office or out on the street and doing things and interacting with people, including electronically, and we want to have privacy. And the message from the government seems to be, if you've got sophisticated people trying to spy on you, into the safe with you. All right. We could talk about the history quite a bit more, but I think one thing that's interesting when thinking about a lot of the conceptual conflict between, say, people who work at intelligence agencies and people who work at civil liberties organizations is this history. And we were just talking about Alan Turing. There's, of course, a film that just came out about him that's not totally historically accurate, but is pretty exciting as a movie, called The Imitation Game. In World War II, there were these major efforts to break the German and Japanese codes that were used to encrypt all of the messages between the commanders and the field units. And the various Allied governments had an unbelievably high level of success in breaking these codes and were able to listen into a lot of traffic. And a lot of historians and a lot of people who are actually directly working on the British war effort say things ranging from this shortened the war by 2 years to this caused the war to be won by the Allies at all, where it would otherwise have been lost. And that's sort of the range of opinion about the significance of the contribution of the code breaking. And it's also an exciting story. One thing that I found astonishing is that the story of the successes that the Allies achieved in breaking the Axis codes was kept secret until the 1970s, about 30 years after the end of the war. And in particular, I was reading one history of this, which described in the 1970s, when some of the stuff started to get declassified, one of the people who ran a major department at Bletchley Park, which was the British Center for Code Breaking, was summoned to receive a decoration from the British government for his efforts during the war. And he told his wife, "Oh, I'm going to go be honored by the government for what I did during the war." She said, "What did you do during the war?" And that was in the 1970s. And so you can imagine that when civil libertarians are celebrating people leaking information about surveillance capabilities from inside governments, it's a bit shocking to people who were proud of the fact that they were able to keep secrets about World War II for 3 decades following the end of the war. And I think particularly, a lot of governments took from this the idea that cryptography is this military thing, and the ability to spy on people is this military advantage, and that governments naturally want to continue this for World War III, right? They want to be prepared so that they can also break the codes and also spy on the people in World War III. And so we have this kind of interesting divergence, because in the 1970s, another thing that happened was that civilians got a hold of cryptography. And I remember reading about a lot of this stuff in the 1990s. My father used to give me newspaper articles about this. And there was this sort of sense of the Prometheus stealing the fire from the gods to give it to humanity, and the fire was cryptography. And the idea was that cryptography was this military thing for decades and decades and decades. And in the 1970s, civilians finally started to study it in a systematic way and try to deploy it in civilian systems for civilian privacy, and say this is not just a military technology, this is a privacy technology for everyone. And that provoked a lot of conflict, because a lot of governments said, what are civilians doing with cryptography? This is a military thing, this is about beating the Nazis in World War II. What are you doing saying this is about privacy? And throughout the Cold War, there was this interesting divergence between the Western states and the communist states about their attitudes toward the practice of surveillance. And I would summarize it this way, and of course there's a lot more that could be said. I would say the Western liberal democracies said, spying on people is terrible. That's what communists do. That's how communists repress people. It's this really awful thing to do. The communist societies are spying on everyone. They're masters of spying. They do it left and right, and that's who they are, and that's not who we are. Meanwhile, they were spending billions of dollars on figuring out how to spy on everyone, and trying to cover up the fact that they were doing it. Whereas in a lot of the communist states, it was actually quite open, and there was actually a desire on the part of some of the secret services to let it be known that they had the capability to monitor the population and that they were monitoring the population. And it was a more direct form of exercise of power, exercise of intimidation, exercise of coercion. You can go to some of the museums now and see some of the apparatus that some of the communist security services used. And they were often eager to be known as people who were watching you. And I feel like this is still a pretty significant split, where the US and a lot of other Western governments still continue to be incredibly secretive about their spying capabilities, while spending enormous amounts of money to develop those capabilities to a very high level. And in particular, prior to the Snowden leaks, there was a remarkable phenomenon where the US government would go out over and over again and rhetorically attack China over this, and say, the Chinese government has no scruples and no morals and accepts no limits, and they're spying on their own people, and they're spying on the world, and they're hacking their own people, and they're hacking the world, and this is unbelievably irresponsible and repressive of them to do this, and it's a result of their closed society and their closed system that they're willing to resort to espionage on this scale with no scruples or limits. And of course, we learned that the US government was developing and using many of the same capabilities. Now, it wasn't using them domestically for the same political ends, but in terms of the capabilities and in terms of the idea that, yeah, we should just hack people in other countries to find out what they're doing and regard that as a normal intelligence gathering technique, that was actually something that the US government was doing, even as it was criticizing China for engaging in that kind of activity. So We did, of course, learn here and there bits and pieces about various forms of surveillance that were being practiced. And I have some colleagues at ACLU and at EFF who are really good at tracking all of this down, following all the details, learning what's going on, uncovering things. One of the amazing moments, I think, was last year. Some of you may have heard about these buildings that have been built in Utah, often called the Utah Data Center, in Bluffdale, Utah, and they're basically huge rooms to store a lot of stuff. According to some people, to store all of the world's communications, because the US government has increasingly found out how to get physical access to all of the world's communications. Then they need a place to record them, to put the hard drives where they're going to store them. And of course, we don't know exactly what they're going to store or exactly on what scale because it's classified, but they built some enormous buildings. So a fun thing that we did last year at EFF, along with Greenpeace and the 10th Amendment Center, is that we took an airship and we flew it directly over the Utah Data Center with this little logo, NSA illegal spying below, and an arrow pointing at them. And we got some nice photos out of that. That was a great project. My colleague Parker is actually right there in the cockpit of that airship above the Utah Data Center. It was a nice moment. At the same time, there are other tactics. So in about 2006, we got some information from a whistleblower named Mark Klein, who was a former employee of AT&T, who said, you know, AT&T has this secret room in the Folsom Street facility on Folsom Street in downtown San Francisco. Over in room 641A, they've got all of these spying machines, and we were told to split all of the fiber optic cables that connect AT&T to other internet service providers so that you get two identical copies of the signal of everything, and send one copy to its normal destination, and send one copy into room 641A. And he said room 641A is NSA, and they're getting a copy of everyone's communications. So actually, EFF filed a lawsuit against AT&T over this. This is an interesting political story because Congress actually passed a law specifically to stop our case from going forward. They actually passed legislation that said companies can't be sued for this. So they weren't denying as such that it was happening, although they passed the law in such a way where they said, we neither confirm nor deny any details of this, but they can't be sued for this. And so our case actually ended as a result of legislation passed to stop our case. But we have another case against the government itself for doing this. We're alleging that it's a Fourth Amendment violation to get a copy of everyone's communications. This edges over into a number of debates about what is the meaning of surveillance and what counts as a privacy invasion, because the government will say things like, well, a human being doesn't actually look at it, or various things get filtered out before it gets stored. The government will say things like this. They'll say, of course, the details are classified and we can't tell you how, but for various reasons, you should be confident that a human being is not looking at your communications unless you're someone we're really interested in.
We filter out the noise, and don't worry, the computers are doing great analysis of it, not a human being.
So our view has been that the government acquiring it in the first place is the privacy invasion and is the violation of law, and that even if they have various procedures where they don't keep all of it or where a human being doesn't look at it right away, the privacy invasion has occurred at the outset, and we're still in litigation against the government for this. So one big thing that happened last year is that this fellow, Edward Snowden, decided to tell the public a lot about what NSA is doing, and he used to work there. He now lives in Russia. A spoiler from the movie Citizen 4 about him is that he lives in Russia with his girlfriend, who was able to join him there. That was sort of the big reveal at the end of Citizen 4, that you think, oh, he had to leave his girlfriend behind when he fled the US, but actually she's able to join him and they live together. And you see this sweet moment where they're cooking pasta and stirring it together over the stove. Anyway, it's amazing that the culture and the press and everyone seemingly have adopted this notion that we're now in the post-Snowden era. So Snowden literally defines an era. You know, we had the pre-Snowden era and the post-Snowden era. And essentially, Mr. Snowden gave a bunch of documents to journalists and said, here are some things that NSA is doing that people might be concerned about. And since then, articles have been appearing. The most recent article appeared just a couple of weeks ago, and various journalists have been working with these documents and writing reports. And we're learning all sorts of things in various directions about the scale and scope and aggressiveness and legal theories and really ambition of a lot of spying that's being done by NSA. And I think, again, it can be kind of a distraction in some ways, because there are other spy agencies and they spy on people in other ways, and there are spy agencies from other countries and there are spy agencies from the US. And the US intelligence community is comprised of more than a dozen intelligence agencies. NSA is only one of them. And so some people have said, what about NRO, right? People who launch satellites. What do all those satellites do? In any event, this is the whistleblower we have. These are the documents that we've seen, and we've learned a lot. I've been quite shocked by a number of things, in particular things like the use of hacking as a policy. Again, the US government used to really harshly criticize the Chinese government for hacking into things in order to spy on people. Turns out that the US government has a whole division in NSA called TAO that does this. That's just hacking people. We learned from these documents that their counterparts in the UK actually hacked the computers of system administrators at a phone company in Belgium because they wanted to have the ability to spy on people who used that phone company. So they said, what's the way to get that ability? I know, we'll hack the personal computers of the people who work for the phone company in Belgium. This is a NATO ally, right? And they're both in the European Union, and they're saying, well, we've got to hack into these system administrators' computers because they're the people who have the ability to let us then secretly spy on whoever's using the Belgian phone system or internet service provider. And so there's this real institutionalization of hacking and saying, yes, we've got to have the capabilities to go and hack people's computers, and we've got to regard that as a normal way of doing business. Another interesting point to me was the sort of level of direct cooperation, intelligence agency to intelligence agency. Not government to government, but intelligence agency to intelligence agency, and the sort of trading and deal-making that goes on. You might even say, reading some of these documents, that spy agencies are conducting their own foreign policy or their own foreign relations, because a spy agency from one nation will go and contact a spy agency from another nation and essentially propose a trade of data or access with them. And so one of the ways that NSA has gotten access to so many fiber optic cables in so many countries is essentially by doing trades with spy agencies and saying, well, if you'll let us tap the fiber optic cables in your country, we'll give you this data from this other country. There's even a suggestion, although we don't have really specific examples of this, that you might have the US government going to one country and trading data about a different country to them in exchange for their domestic communications data, and at the same time going to the other country and trading that country's data to them. So essentially trading the two countries' data to each other in exchange for the US government getting access to both of them.
I mean, this is what's been done throughout history. The amount of data and how they do it changes. But spying, I don't think anybody should be at least bit surprised by it. As the technology gets more sophisticated, spy agencies are really trying to stay up with the technology. They've always traded information between governments and agencies. It's getting more sophisticated. I don't think anybody should be at least bit surprised that it's being done. But, you know, fortunately we have organizations like yours to help keep the government honest, or as honest as possible. But should we be surprised that they're doing that, or overly concerned they're doing that? Is my question.
So, I mean, a lot of people have had this sort of side debate about whether they were surprised by things that Snowden revealed, and whether different people were surprised or should have been surprised. It's a kind of weird debate in some ways, but it's definitely something that a lot of people have engaged in. A lot of people, in a sense, and I'm not accusing you of this, tried to sort of defend their sophistication, saying, you know, this thing was obvious to me, or this thing was obvious to me, or this thing was obvious to me, and I'm not surprised by these things. While I think a lot of other people were surprised by things. I don't really know how to quantify or summarize where does the surprise come in. To me, this sort of direct spy agency to spy agency diplomacy bypassing the civilian authorities was surprising. And you even see in some of the GCHQ documents that they say that the civilian governments of these nations often don't know that it's happening. So if you went and asked the parliaments of these countries, you know, did you know that we traded information about our citizens to the Americans in exchange for information about such and such? The parliaments apparently in many cases would say, I've never heard anything about that in my life. And so you might think of that as a strange question for the notion of civilian control over military or intelligence agencies, whether they actually are accountable and responsible to civilian authorities, or whether they've just sort of been told, well, we want to know what's going on in the world, so go figure out a way to do it, and don't bother yourself about other considerations.
I'm not saying don't bother yourself. I think the bigger threat out there, not our governments acquiring information, are the professional and not so professional hacking organizations that are out there to destroy lives purposely for the sake of their own profitable financial gain. I think that's the bigger threat to the average person, not the government acquiring massive amounts of data to do some metrics on population. People's lives are being destroyed through company lack of security practices, people actually really giving out their information to websites they don't even know where they're going. So to the average person, the biggest threat is not the government, but these professional and not so professional hacking organizations.
So it might depend a lot on where people live. Because we've met plenty of people who are quite scared that their government will actually imprison them or kill them.
Sure.
It's not necessarily a consideration that a lot of people in the US share to the same extent. But I do think there's this sort of parallel issue that we're learning about, that computer security is really terrible, and most motivated organizations, which can include governments and can include criminal organizations and can include activist organizations, which may also be criminal in some cases, if they want to hack something, their success rate is astronomically high. And we're seeing that over and over again, where there are companies that are trusted with people's personal information, and they try to take some security precautions. And someone comes along, whether that's a government, whether that's a financial fraud organization, whether that's someone who just wants to harass people, whether that's someone who wants to disrupt something for a political purpose, and they try to attack these organizations, and the common case is that they succeed. The common case is not that they fail. And so we're really seeing that computer security is fragile to non-existent, and it's sort of coming to feel like open season, where some expert wants to hack something and they do. And they get in and they get through and they accomplish their purpose. And so I think there's this sort of crisis, and you can relate it to surveillance to the extent that hacking is a powerful means of surveillance that's been normalized or routinized as a way of spying on people. And you can relate it to a lot of other concerns, that there's a crisis of computer security. There's a crisis of protection of people's data. There's a trend of someone wants to get in and they do. EFF has a project called Surveillance Self-Defense, which I wanted to promote to all of you. We refer to it as SSD for short, and this is the address where you can go read about it. Because people ask, what should I do, or what can I do, or how do I protect myself, or how do I respond to all of these privacy concerns and all of these threats that are out there. And we've been working on this, and it's still a work in progress, but we've managed to put out an edition of it. And I'd encourage people to take a look. I have to say that when I'm thinking about the big picture, I do feel a bit pessimistic about all of this, because as I said much earlier, a lot of people are looking for an app or a tool, or they want something to protect themselves. And they want to just be able to take one action and install one thing and then be safe. against whatever kinds of threats they're concerned about. Because we know, and we emphasize in here, that different people have very different threat models, which sort of returns to your point. Different people, when they think about who is going to do something bad to me or something that I regard as harmful, envision very, very different entities as their main source of threat. So you have journalists who are being contacted by confidential sources, and the journalists are saying, well, if this source is informing on a drug trafficking gang, then my threat is that the drug trafficking gang is going to figure out who the source is and then assassinate them, which has been a major concern in Latin America, although often it's the journalists themselves who are assassinated in that situation. But sometimes the sources, if the sources can be identified by the drug traffickers against whom they informed. Or if the confidential source is from a company or a government, there may be a concern that the company or the government will figure out who the source is, and then they'll be able to retaliate against the source in some way. And so there you have, even depending on what's the nature of the information that's being given to the journalist, people perceive very different threats, very different people who are trying to come after them and get the information. And a lot of people have very sort of simple and local threats. So we've heard a lot about people who are dealing with domestic violence and stalking. And people are concerned that there's maybe one particular person whom they don't want to know their location. And they're not necessarily thinking, I want to prevent the intelligence agency of the Russian Federation from knowing my location, but they're thinking, you know, I want to prevent my ex from knowing my location. And so people have a real spectrum of different concerns about whom they're thinking of as the threat or the threats that preoccupy them. And we try to talk a bit about that. My source of pessimism is basically at the high level when people are being attacked by an expert. The conventional wisdom in the information security field now is that the expert attacker generally wins. The expert attacker generally succeeds, and I was alluding to that before. And I think that even if someone is following a lot of the advice in here, if there's an expert attacker coming after them directly, the expert attacker is likely to have a lot of success. And again, a lot of the tools do very specific things. So a lot of the cryptographic tools, we've been promoting the use of encryption for decades for individual privacy. A lot of the encryption tools are basically about preventing someone from being able to listen into the content of what you say. Right, so if I'm making a call to you, if I'm writing an email to you, if we use encryption, then someone who tries to intercept that may not be able to understand the content. However, those tools don't manage to conceal the fact that I contacted you. On my interview earlier today, I was talking about a study at Stanford that looked into what you could learn about someone just by learning what phone numbers they called and when. This is information that we learned from Edward Snowden. The very first thing that was revealed was that the US government has seemingly a complete list of all of the phone calls that are made in the US, which is not something in our view that they were ever authorized to get under law, although they have a weird interpretation that phone bills are tangible things. And so a law that allowed them to request tangible things could allow them to request every phone record, and the every phone record could be interpreted according to the government as an instance of a tangible thing, so they could get every phone record. In any case, the Stanford researchers were examining the question of what could you learn about someone by looking at whom they called, and they were able to identify things like one of the volunteer participants in the study got an abortion during the study. And they were able to identify that from various things about whom did this person call and when. And that didn't require listening to the call, right? It was enough to say, this person called these numbers on this schedule, and that's typical of someone who was contacting an abortion provider and got an abortion. And there are other examples where they identified very specific things just based on the timing and the numbers that were called. And so when you have some privacy tool, it's saying, I'm going to conceal this information from these people. And it's not saying, I'm going to conceal everything about you that you ever do from everyone. It's saying, we have a technical means to obfuscate or hide or protect this fact or this aspect. And that narrowness, I think, is an important limitation, and it's difficult for people to understand because they don't have a clear mental model of how their communications work at a technical level. So you say, we only protect this thing, and people say, I don't even know what that is. So we hope that surveillance self-defense is clear enough that it will help people who are interested a bit in this area. And we're still working on it, and we'd love to hear what people think about it. I'm still writing additional sections for it. I think I should stop there. I know people may want to use the bathroom. People may have other things they want to talk about. I've been speaking for quite a while. As I said, there's a lot of different directions that one could go in. So I think I'll stop there. There's a bathroom downstairs, right? If anyone feels the need, you can feel free to go, and I can stick around for some time if people have questions or further comments. Thank you all for coming.